Okay, so let's talk about self-destruction, at least from an environmental standpoint. Let's be specific about what that might mean. I think one option certainly is unsustainable rates of natural resource consumption. If we're using and extracting natural resources at a rate that exceeds their natural cycle of renewal, plus our ability to through technological advances, develop substitutes or substitute products that we can use in their place. That certainly would have an implication on the amount of time we can stick around Earth, and potentially be ourselves a communicative civilization. Whether that means dependence on raw materials like fuel, including fossil fuel, metals, wood, food, and important inputs for food, soil, nutrients, especially phosphorus, unsustainable fishing. And then there are other issues related to the degradation of environmental systems, especially reduced value of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are, of course, the um, economic benefits that we derive from natural environmental systems, whether that's storm surge protection or natural filtering and cleaning of water. Um, through forested systems. There are lots and lots of examples of ecosystem services and real benefits we may lose if we don't take care of them, as well as pollution, right? So emitting either emissions into harmful pollutants into the air or water that directly impacts human health. And then, of course, there's big bad climate change. I think when we talk about climate change, there are a lot of different things that we think of when we're specifically within the context of impacts from climate change having significant implications for humans and the longevity of society and civilization as we know it. They range from temperature increases, sea level rise, increased storm severity, um, decreased food productivity from altered weather patterns to more prevalent pests and plant diseases, more widespread infectious diseases for humans, species die-offs, extreme events, and then of course migration. I mean, if you think back to the map I showed earlier, with the quote from Elon Musk about all the different coastal cities around the world with more than 1 million people. If those people move or have to move relatively quickly, where do they go, and what other places absorb them, and does that cause a series of social problems that are destructive in their own right? So it's worth considering when we talk about climate change, as opposed to some of those other natural resource problems that we mentioned, pollution, over extraction, why climate change is particularly difficult to solve. And I think there are a number of important points to look at here. One of the most fundamental challenges in terms of addressing climate change is that we know all the bad stuff, mostly the really bad stuff, is going to happen in the future and pretty far out into the future. I mean, if you compare it to the average human lifespan, we're talking about you know really significant effects decades from now. But it requires immediate action, and that's just fundamentally a very difficult problem for humans to solve. And we'll talk more about why, and we'll give some economic context to why this type of problem is difficult. The other challenge related to climate change is uncertainty, both in terms of the timing of when we will feel impacts, as well as the severity of those impacts. And you could also extend that to how those impacts are distributed geographically or spatially. What regions experience impacts at what time and to what degree of severity. So I think particularly within a policymaking context, this has been problematic. It's difficult to convince um, politicians, and even if you can convince them, I guess it's a certain number of them, it's difficult to convince the public and to engage in political discourse when you're or a debate about an issue when the answer a lot of times is we don't know, and it's okay to not know. It's okay to know what you don't know. But I think this does make it more difficult to form policy around what to do about climate change. The other really scary part about climate change is the potential for tipping points and irreversibility. So it's not like a lake that let me say a river that we could pollute, um, that we might, given enough time and energy in cleaning it up, reverse that pollution and restore it to some sort of ecologically viable state. Um, when we're talking about climate change, there is a very real risk that we push things beyond a point of no return. And so what that means is it's a race. We can't wait forever to solve it. We have to either do it now or we won't. Another, I think, challenge, especially on the policy side, maybe not national policy, but certainly geopolitical challenges, are related to the fact that emission sources, as well as the impacts from climate change, are not evenly distributed. We all sort of know, I think, and recognize, or we should, that the United States has been a leader in contributing to the problem of climate change. We are probably not the first on the list of who we would worry about from the most immediate impacts of climate change. For example, low-lying island nations that will be completely subsumed by ocean water. Certainly there are parts of the United States that will be more or less impacted by climate change, but this makes it very difficult uh, in terms of sort of socializing and allocating the responsibility associated with mitigating climate change, particularly related to decreasing future emissions. There's a lot of argument across participating countries about how much each country is responsible and for climate change, and how that should, what kind of implications that should have for future emissions reductions. In other words, should countries that haven't polluted yet be allowed to pollute a bit more in the future, whereas countries that have polluted a lot, i.e. the United States, be required to more quickly and severely curb emissions? One of the other issues, and I think this is going to be, within the context of the energy industry, what we talk about the most this semester is that economies and institutions are not well equipped to move quickly. I think to either reduce emissions or to adapt to climate change. When we think about economies and institutions, let's think about that in terms of what sectors of the economy are producing greenhouse gas emissions. So we're thinking now less on the adaptation side, and more about mitigating the impacts by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So who's responsible globally for, not on a country by country basis, but on if you're looking at different sectors of the economy, who's producing these emissions? And this pie chart gives you sort of an approximate breakdown of where greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. A big piece of that pie is energy, whether that's energy use in the transportation sector, energy use in industry, energy use in the electric power sector. So in some ways, when we talk about energy in the environment, whatever that means, right? It's the title of the course. We're talking about the climate crisis. Given the significant role that the energy industry plays in producing greenhouse gas emissions. And the goal, of course, is to reduce emissions from the energy sector as quickly as possible. Now, the complicating factors, just like all the complicating factors of dealing with climate change in general, are that there are all these other competing objectives that we have to maintain. We have to maintain social and economic prosperity. And at least in the U.S., where we do not have a centrally planned economy like China, we can't rely on it's the decision making is distributed. We live in for the most part, a democracy. We have one economic system, um, capitalism, and that we have, ostensibly no plans of changing. And so the trick is how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible in the social and economic system that we have in place. And that becomes much more complicated. And part of the reason that it's complicated sort of has to do with the way we define sustainability. Sustainability does not just mean environmental sustainability. It also means social sustainability, having communities that are strong and nurture future generations to grow up and be successful and happy, as well as economic sustainability. And all of these are sort of interdependent at some level. So, I think the economic sustainability and financial sustainability is something that we're gonna talk about early in the semester, and we're going to come back to it late in the semester because I think it's a very potent source of resistance, or can be, in dealing with climate change. And so this brings up the New York Times article that I assigned everybody to read before the course started. And the whole idea here was to think about whether the idea of reducing emissions to a degree that we're actually able to mitigate the harmful impacts of climate change would imply reduced economic growth or zero economic growth, right? And whether that is acceptable from from an ethical standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint, from a political standpoint, and I think that's to some degree an open question. But the reality, I think the overwhelming consensus among most everyone would be that no, we're not willing to sacrifice economic growth to mitigate climate change. Not to a degree that is sort of talked about in this article. And we're gonna. This is an issue that we'll return to throughout the semester. I think the reality is, and one of the most sort of vexing aspects about climate change as a problem is that we kind of know how to fix it. And that there's this sense of that our hands are tied. And one of the things that I really want everyone to get out of this class this semester is, who's tying our hands, and how are they tied exactly, and how do we untie, or can we untie them, and if so, how do we do that? And I think that's this idea of environmental versus economic sustainability is something that we're gonna return to, and will be a constant theme throughout the semester. So the idea of balancing that trade-off between economic growth or financial success and environmental sustainability is a challenge and a trade-off that may be fundamentally different for different areas of the world. And this is to sort of demonstrate that. We're going to talk about what's called an environmental Kuznets curve. So this is a concept from environmental economics, and what it shows on the y-axis is environmental degradation or pollution. And you can sort of interpret that any way you want, but within the context of climate change, certainly that would imply CO2 emissions. On the x-axis, what it shows is the stage of economic development. And as a metric, we're talking about income per capita or economic growth. And so what you see is this sort of parabolic trajectory, right, where countries or regions start out in the bottom left, which means they're not very well economic developed, but they're also not polluting the earth that much. And as they develop economically, they pollute one for one, right? They're on this linear trajectory where the more they develop, the more they pollute. However, that starts to level off. And at some point in the middle stage of economic development, there is a tipping point, a turning point that is a good turning point in this case, which is industrial economies develop into post-industrial economies or service economies. And so at that point, they are continuing to grow economically, but their levels of environmental degradation and pollution are starting to decrease. And so this is sort of the conventional wisdom and I think past experience or historical experiences that developing countries, so countries that start off on the left part of that graph, tend to exploit natural resources at a higher rate than what we would refer to as developed countries. And that has to do with maybe an oversimplified rationale in this case, but we can sort of think about it as countries that are developing simply have bigger fish to fry than to think about the environment. They have other more critical pressing issues to take care of, lifting people out of poverty, for example, than how many tons of CO2 they're putting into the atmosphere. But it doesn't always work that way, and we should all hope that it will not work this way in the future. And specifically within the context of the electric power industry, there is some potential for countries that are developing to skip ahead, right? To not necessarily develop economically at the expense of the environment. And in some ways, and in some cases, it might be easier for countries that are less developed to adopt newer, cheaper technologies. And that's because they don't have a legacy of investing in infrastructure, specific types of infrastructure that are tied to more polluting types of to more polluting types of energy production. So we'll touch on this some too, in particular within the context of renewable energy adoption. And so what we're really hoping for, I think in some respects, the future of developed economies in terms of renewable energy adoption and reducing dependence on fossil fuels is a foregone conclusion. It will happen. Now, there's a big question mark about how quickly it will happen, and that's very important. But in terms of making or breaking the climate crisis, I think there is sort of an acceptance that a lot of the developing countries, what happens there, will really determine, in some cases, where we end up on the climate change trajectory. What we're hoping for and what we should actively support is the ability of developing countries to sort of cheat this Kuznets curves, to not follow the same trajectory that we did, to develop economically without contributing to environmental degradation. Now, who bears the responsibility for that is a very contentious issue. So in this class, even though there are lots of different sources of greenhouse gas emissions, we are going to focus almost entirely on electricity. And we're going to use the electric power sector as a case study for the larger complex issues that emerge when we're talking about some sustainable development. And so the reason about why to focus here is that that's what I do. I'm mostly on the electric power side in terms of the research that I conduct. And it's exciting, in the electric power industry because things are changing pretty quickly. For a long time they didn't, and now they're changing pretty quickly. It makes it scary for some people if you're on the wrong side of history, and for others it's a kind of an interesting time to be involved. It's also an industry that directly impacts the environment in multiple ways, but also financial markets and the economy and in some cases, maybe even social equality. And there are also pretty good job opportunities in the electric power industry. And so, having some expertise in this as students coming out of undergrad might be helpful.